always graspable and manageable. So personally, I'm not so much about boiling complex things down to a simple statement or a simple number, but I rather try to invite people to understand the complexities and all the intricacies of a complex phenomenon, right? And there's a couple of ways you can do that. So one approach is, for instance, make something really tangible. So here's one solution I came up with as part of a team, of course, for the Max Planck Science Gallery. So Max Planck Research Society has this sort of showroom in Berlin where they show all their ongoing research. And I was able to fill this touch screen installation here on the right-hand side with content. And what we did was we visualized how the Max Planck Institutes collaborate among each other, but also with their external partners. So you could see who's working most with MIT or which, let's say, universities are the best collaboration partners in astrophysics or something like this. And the way we solved this is we have this big touch screen and a big network visualization visualizing all the different Max Planck Institutes. People could zoom and pan and always set one specific focus point. So they could say, I'm interested now in this Max Planck Institute for Extraterrestrial Physics. Now, who is important when we look at this institute? Like, who are the important collaboration partners? How does that stack up worldwide and within Germany? And the basis of that were the scientific publications. So we were looking at who are the people working in these institutes writing papers with together, right? And so behind the system, there's like hundreds of thousands of scientific publications, which we then analyzed and boiled down to this, in the end, fairly digestible and simple visualization, because instead of having like lots of lists and drop-down menus or something, you could just have one single focus point, and this was the main interaction. Of course, you could zoom and pan, but the main point was just setting one focus point and everything arranges around that. So finding that one, that one pivot point or the one hinge where we could center the whole experience around was key in this project. A similar project that's already 5 or 6 years old, actually, is something I was involved with during my time in Potsdam when I was a research assistant. And we built an installation for the Venice Biennale of Architecture. And it was a table, and you could use it with paper cards. So you could pick a card representing an architectural project, and it would have a marker on the back-end side, and you could put it on a table, and the table will draw the conceptual connections between the projects represented on their cards. So you might have 3 or 4 architectural projects, and if they have a certain building style or a certain material or an algorithm used in the construction in common, the table would indicate that. You will also see the media items associated with that project, and you could use the card as a turnable sort of jog wheel type interface to browse through the media assets. What's interesting about this project is, I think, 2 things. So first of all, you start with a blank slate and you just put things there and you construct the network yourself. So instead of presenting everything and then saying, well, how do you want to narrow down? We went the opposite route and said, like, here's a blank slate, start playing and you will see what happens. I think that's an interesting mechanism. And the second one, as you can see already, is, of course, the social situations arising from, putting information somewhere in the world where
the
people
conference
can
is about to end.
Oh, that's rare. Questions? I'll just go on. Yeah. You can't stop me. Yeah. Anyway, so the interesting thing is really what happens socially when you put information in such a large public display, when people can use it together, right? I think that's super interesting. What happens instead of, just one person looking at the data and meditating on it, what happens when you discuss data together, when you construct knowledge together. And I think this is, although the technical possibilities are all there, it's still by far not well exploited yet, what we can do with these collaborative interfaces and in these collaborative settings. So these have been 2 examples where information was made tangible in a very literal way, with the paper cards, with touchscreen interfaces. But there's also other ways. So one way is to use metaphors. And here's one project that has been a big theme for me because I've been working on it now for 4 years. And it's the OECD Better Life Index. And here we chose a certain metaphor to represent well-being in countries around the world. And the way this works is in principle, so you can see all these different flowers representing different countries. It's mainly the OECD countries. And we measure the conditions there according to a whole variety of things. So instead of just looking at jobs and income and things that are very easily, quantifiable, the OECD decided to put focus also on more, harder to measure, but also important things like work-life balance, life satisfaction, health, civic engagement, education, to sort of paint a full picture of the conditions in a country. You could be a very rich nation, but maybe be lacking in work-life balance or in health, right? And so this multidimensionality has been one really important part of this project. And the second part is that users should be able to make their own priorities or to make their own choices, what they find most important. Because, the OECD is known for putting out these authoritative lists where it says like, Finland is best in education, and I don't know, Australia is maybe best in happiness. But they start to acknowledge that maybe the perspective you choose or the weighting you give to these topics can change how the ranking plays out, and they put the control there back to the users. And so we came up with a website where people could explore in a very playful way what happens when you change these priorities. You can start with all topics being equally important and you get a certain ranking, but you could also say you value civic engagement the highest, and then Sweden and Australia rise to the top. They are now the best flowers. Or if you say income is more important, then the United States and Luxembourg will catch up. And so depending on how you distribute your interests and how you distribute the priorities, the country ranking will change. And this is also visualized by the size of these flower petals changing. The length is always the score, that doesn't change, but the width is how much weight the user gives to a topic. And in combination, this sort of plays out to be you sort of multiply these two visually. And that's a very playful and of course a very unusual interface for data, especially for a traditional organization like the OECD, who's known for putting out big books with bar charts, basically. So it has been sort of a big topic for them. And it started off as an interesting data visualization project, but it has developed a life of its own, let's say, right? So people started to recognize the visualization because it has such a characteristic form, and it became a branding instrument for the whole initiative. And now the whole general idea of measuring well-being and alternative measures of country success is tied to that visual, that flower visual. So it has become an icon, more or less, for the whole initiative, which I think is interesting because it really started out as a data visualization project and became something much bigger. We should also note we do have a lot of depth and analysis behind that, right? So what you saw is the homepage, sort of the main attraction point. But once you're interested in one of the topics or one of the countries more in detail, you will get a lot of really hard numbers and analysis behind that. But if we would have started with something like that, people would have been scared away. So that sequence of how do you draw people in and at which point do you disclose how much complexity is really important. As I said, it's a fairly successful project. So we went through 4 project iterations, actually over 3 years. We have 6 languages, millions of visitors. And people actually share these indexes they created quite a bit, which is for us a very important point. And I think I hinted at that already, but I think on the one hand, this multidimensionality has been really important. So people actually like complex things if they are presented right. This playfulness and the personalization. So we turn back the question, what's important to you, instead of just saying, here's what we found. We asked actually, what's important to you, and then present you the right information. And then this iconic visual, which might be a bit imprecise, absolutely, no doubt about that, but at the same time, it's so striking and so iconic that people remember having visited that site even weeks later, and that has been a big part of the success, I think. Just a few notes on workflow. So how do I come up with these types of projects? So from the client, I usually ask for 2 things. So I want to know what's the goal? Why are we doing this at all? And can I have some data? Because you can have great ideas on paper. If they don't check out with the data, you're in trouble. At the same time, playing with the data can give you good ideas visually as well. So I like to play with data as material and experiment. And so usually there's sort of a back and forth, sort of reframing, rescoping the project based on what we learned from the data, and also asking maybe for new data if we have a good strategic or a good content idea, right? And once this has settled to a sort of stable point, sometimes it's lots of iterations, sometimes it's fairly quick, then we can go into a more traditional design, production, launch, project pipeline, a normal one, let's say. One thing that is always underestimated, I think, is what happens after the things are launched and what happens after they go out. How do people actually use it? And ideally, you will feed in the findings from that, watching how people use the thing you built into the next project iteration. And in the Better Life Index, in the lucky position that we can do these multiple iterations and improve on the site every year. So these two feedback loops are really important. For this project, the first feedback loop, playing with the data in the beginning and experimenting a lot with different visual solutions has been really important. And here's just a small fraction of all the solutions we explored in this initial design phase before we came up with that flower visual. And this was sort of the first prototype. And some things you can only judge once you see it with the actual data, like in this case, 11 topics and 40 countries. It's a very specific situation. Some solutions might, like this one might look good in the beginning, but then you realize once they overlap, they're not separable anymore, right? And with the flowers, when they overlap, you can easily still separate. And these are things, they're obvious in hindsight, but you have to sort of experience it yourself in that concrete data situation. The second feedback loop is really interesting, I think. So we can now visualize on the website as well what matters most to the people using the site. So we were analyzing the responses we got from the different countries. And for instance, we can say now that to people in Germany, life satisfaction is most important because they put the slider all the way up, usually, or more often than others. And we know a bit about the demographics, gender, and age because we asked users after they shared their index if we can ask them a few basic demographic questions. And from the bigger countries, we have a few thousand responses, so we can actually, start to compare them with each other and see like what's most important to people in these different countries. And I think that's an interesting perspective that instead of just putting out data, we can now or the OECD can also now see what's most important to the people in the countries using the website. So that's one exciting extension to the site, or the general principle we're exploring further at this point. Another one is, and this was just recently launched, is going regional. Because as you all know, a big country, well, it's a big container, and the differences within a country can be much bigger, as we all know, than between countries. So the differences between the richest and the poorest in one country can be huge. And it's very hard to quantify that because it's very hard to find good measurements of all these, well-being indicators on a regional level, but this is now the first effort. And we have been looking at 350 regions across the world. So it's the top level administrative regions in the OECD countries. And we were able to find 10 good indicators we can compare about these. And the way this site works, so it's sort of a sister site, let's say, to the Better Life Index. And the site will detect your location, so where you're accessing the site from. In this case, northwestern Switzerland. And we can see it's doing great on education, but not so great on civic engagement. So the voter turnouts are not that great here. And surprisingly, environment is not that great too. So the image seems to... So instead of presenting this big overview, we dive in here with a very concrete view on one region, ideally the region people live in, because they can relate to that, and then start to compare that to other regions, like, let's say, the rest of Switzerland, or globally, and so on. So the strategy here has been to not try and provide the big picture straight away, but dive into very specific topics, or very specific regions, and take it from there. One feature you might have seen, I'll try and rewind here. very strange here with the let's see. So, but one feature I really like is this. You might have seen that it's the similar regions in other countries. Oh. I'm not sure what's going on with the video here. Let's see. I have a few screenshots, so that's easier. So, so we have a mass of information. We have like 10 different indicators for 350 regions. How do we put that in a meaningful order, and how do we make that comparable? And one way we do it here is with these flowers, as you have seen, but these detailed cards. Once you click a topic, no. I think that they have a nice and interesting mechanism in how they work. So let's say in this case, we have Madrid selected and we're looking at jobs. And the first thing we present is just the score. So Madrid has a score of 4.1 in jobs, but you might wonder what does that even mean, right? And so the second information we disclose is, it says, this puts the region in position 6 out of 19 regions in Spain. So you understand, actually, although 4.1 doesn't sound that great, in Spain, it's sort of in the upper third, right? Because Spain overall is pretty bad off, as you can see. And you can see the whole distribution here from 0 to 5 on this thing. But then again, globally speaking, it's actually in the bottom 18%, because the bottom 20% span until here, until score 5 or so. So understanding all these different distributions are necessary in order to understand a simple single data point like a 4.1 in jobs. But at the same time, if you would provide all the context all the time, nobody would get it, right? So in this case, we disclose it in these 3 simple steps in plain language sentences, and then underline it with like a chart and making the distributions understandable. And in this way, we try to, it is complex to understand, simple numbers like these, but try to sort of put it into a sequence that makes sense. The other nice detail we integrated is all of these individual facts you can find are individually shareable. So this sentence, for instance, saying, I don't know, Madrid is in the top 37% in jobs. If you hover over that, you will get a little menu immediately that allows people to tweet exactly that fact, linking back to that index page. And by making all of that individually shareable, people actually started to comment on it and to share all these facts individually. And third, as I said, there's actually no big picture visualization, right? So instead of trying and providing the big analytical overview, we start at a point that people know best, and then allow them ways to compare to other regions. So this one was just launched last week, and we're now excited to see how people adopt it. And we hope that, for instance, local media will adopt it, especially to report on their region, or maybe put pressure on their local politicians and so on. So just briefly, I have to wrap it up soon, as we're a bit behind. Just 2 more quick, more experimental explorations. So one was a data arts commission for the London 2012 for the Olympic Games 2 years ago. And as part of a bigger team, I was investigating what was the social media response to the games. So you can see what's happening in the stadium, you can also see what's happening on TV, but what's the big picture of how people respond online to the games? And what we did is analyze Twitter messages, and we analyzed them for topics and also emotional tone, like are these cheering messages or cursing messages, you would say. And we put them to use in 3 different visualizations: a real-time data visualization, sort of data journalistic activities, and the data sculpture. And I'll just briefly walk you through that. So on the website, you could see at any time what's the current mood around the game. So are people happy? Is there a lot of interest or not so much? And so on. And we have had, again, sort of a metaphoric visualization, a bit like the Olympic torch. And on the top-hand side, you see all the positive messages, and on the bottom, the blue part, are all the negative ones. And you can see all the messages fly by. You can sort them in different ways. But it's a very ephemeral and very fleeting experience. It's just focused on the now. And to contrast that, we actually built a data sculpture representing all the 12 million tweets we were able to collect. And in this sculpture, each day is represented with 1 plate. And again, all the negative messages are at the bottom and all the positive ones at the top. And we augmented that physical sculpture, which was custom CNC milled, with a digital projection overlay. So we were able to highlight different parts of the sculpture depending on which topic people were interested in. So the big relief, sort of the physical relief, would always display the global distribution of tweets, when was the highest attention to the games overall, and then we had these digital overlays, and you could dive into different topics like individual teams or individual athletes to see what were the most significant moments for them. And overall, it was a 4-meter-long installation, and people could actually explore more or less all 12 million tweets in that physical form. They're not hard to produce these days. That's the interesting part, I think. So with 3D printing and custom milling, it's actually very easy and affordable to do three-dimensional custom objects, and I think it's very exciting to explore how that affects how we deal with information. And the third part was sort of looking at individual topics around the games, like while the games developed, we identified key themes that emerged and looked at how was that reflected in the Twitter landscape, more or less. And so we came up with these new type of graphs we call them centigraphs. And you can see in the vertical movement the mood. So if the graph goes to the top and has a more orange color, we have more positive messages. If it goes to the bottom and it's blue, we have more negative ones. And the thickness of the lines is how many tweets we have. Because you might have a lot of fluctuation, but it's based on very little amount of messages. But then you might have two big events, maybe causing a lot of excitement. Maybe not much change in the emotional content, but a lot of change in the volume. And so by combining these two things, your eye is drawn immediately to the most significant points in the data. And so we learned a lot about, for instance, the badminton players, that purposely lost to have a better position in the quarterfinals, which immediately was shown in the data. Or for instance, when Ryan Lochte admitted that he had peed in the Olympic swimming pool, his score dropped immediately. So, but he recovered quite quickly, so it's not that bad. Last project, even more far out, so that was fairly traditional, but here in Data Cuisine, it's an experimental activity, and we're investigating what's the language of food for communicating information. And I think that's a very interesting thought to pursue, because usually in graphics we have visual variables, so we have dots, we have lines, we have areas, we give them different properties that mean something, right? So we change the color, we change the position to represent information. And now the question is, what are the culinary variables we can work with, right? So what can we change about food that represents information? And of course you can paint with food, so you can do two-dimensional diagrams, you can build stuff, you can make a pile out of mashed potatoes or so. So you can do anything you do with sculptures. But of course you also have tastes, you have textures, temperatures, all the cultural connotations, all the ingredients, they bring rich cultural meaning with them. Do you use potatoes or caviar to indicate unemployment? All the cooking parameters, and how do you actually present the food, and how does it get to the people consuming it? And so the way we do it, we get together. So I do this with Susanne Jaschko, the second one here from the right, who came up with the idea, and we organize workshops, and people bring their favorite ingredients, and then the first 2 days we just brainstorm ideas around food and data. It's always tied to a place, so it's about local data with local food. So we did it in Helsinki, and it was about Helsinki statistics, and we did it in Barcelona recently, and that was about Barcelona. And we try and first explore that space, what could we do, what could be interesting. That sort of brainstorming, and then the last 2 days, so it's been a 4-day activity last time, we go into the kitchen actually and do more like food storming, you could say. And people experiment, how can we turn interesting statistics about Barcelona in this case into food, like how to work with different preparations. And we have a real chef, like in this case, Sebastian Veilla, who helps the participants with, innovative cooking techniques and how to conceptualize dishes. At this event, we also had a food printer. So anything that can be done in 3D printing can also be done in food, potentially. So here on the left-hand side is printing honey, or chocolate works quite well, or cream cheese. So we can build sculptures based on 3D files, basically, out of food. Yeah, and a lot of work goes into the presentation, how to arrange the dishes so they look good, right? And so in this case, we had 11 different data dishes that were first examined and discussed, and of course in the end consumed. So the idea is not to do just, you know, an image with food, but actually that the information transmits itself once you eat it. You know, that's sort of the idea. And it's a bit hard to imagine what that means, but here, for instance, you have an unemployed pan con tomate, and it's the unemployment rate in Spain. Youth unemployment is huge, and so as you progress through time in this line chart, you have less and less tomatoes, and the bread gets much harder to eat because it's only oil and garlic, and that's sort of the rising unemployment rate. And this leads to a lot of emigration of young people from Spain. And so this team decided to take up that theme, and they made an emigration fish. And here you have all the people staying in Spain at the front, but the one at the back here, it's the other part of the same fish, but now sliced in different pieces representing the different countries where people emigrate. And the UK section, you know, was maybe 16% or something like this, and was fried in a batter like you would do for fish and chips. And the French portion is prepared in wine, of course. And the funny thing is, once you taste that fish, you're actually taken to that country, right? So if you do it right, you're mentally taken to that place, you know, while you consume the information. We had first aid noodles, so this team did a series of 3 dishes on the sex behavior of young people in Barcelona based on a Facebook survey they did on the fly. I have to jump through that a bit. Requiem for Science, these are 2 cakes, and one is prepared before the science funding cuts in Spain, so a lot of science funding was cut. And the one prepared before, when the funding situation was still good, uses scientific techniques like a microwave and like a special foaming technique and so on. And it has 100% of sugar, like the proper amount. And that's the left-hand one. And the right-hand one is after the funding, no science involved in cooking, very basic techniques, and only 66% amount of sugar because like 34% of science funding was cut, and it's very hard to eat, and it's just not as enjoyable and not as good overall. So you can eat how science funding cuts affect your taste, actually. And yeah, people document, we're quite rigorous in the sense that there should be a recipe, it should be replicable, you have food ingredients, you have data ingredients, and certain preparation for both, and that goes together in the dish. And of course, the most important part is always like the people and the dishes and this whole experience. And yeah, you can read more about the project here. And you might say that's a silly way of representing information, right? But in a way, you know, it's very imprecise. You cannot do big data with it. You know, it takes quite a while and so on. So there's a lot of cases to be made, like, yeah, how that would be a silly way to represent information. But I think at the same time, it's a very interesting way, and a very emotional and very deep way of consuming information. And I like to compare that a bit with what happens on the web at the moment. So we have a lot of, if you search for infographic on the web, you get a lot of loud and noisy pieces, and everybody's trying to catch your attention, right? And I like to compare that practice to basically to fast food, right? As on the left-hand side, it's quickly digestible, throwaway, greasy, sweet, industrial products. And the things I try to achieve are much more along the slow food or the slow data, you know, side of things maybe, where we think about the ingredients, we craft experiences very much to the point. We try to respect the ingredients, like the data, but also the diner, the user digesting the information, and ultimately really create memorable personal experiences. Because, you know, we're so busy with consuming lots of information, and if you eat that unemployment fish, you will not forget that statistic for the rest of your life, basically. You know, so it's a very simple data point, but that goes very deep. And I like to work more towards that end. So I think that's it. Thank you. I don't know if we have time for a few questions, but okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you.